Good morning, everyone. With regard to piracy, most scholars of piracy conduct their research within a general narrative that goes like this. A major reason why pirates prospered and multiplied in the Atlantic was that European governments tolerated them, even encouraged and supported them when they attacked enemy trade. So when the English government eventually changed course and decided to put a stop to it, it was able to eradicate piracy within a single generation, from the 1690s to the 1720s. So it was an abrupt change and a very successful one. And the secret of success was force. The British officials used the Royal Navy, Customs Service, and the courts to confront, chase, capture, convict, and execute pirates. They used the courts also to hound and intimidate pirates' many commercial partners and political backers at port. And this aggressive law enforcement at sea and port was part of an orchestrated and successful PR campaign aimed at the general public: merchants, retailers, consumers, sailors, voters, to turn public opinion against piracy. The result being that the government converted coastal communities that had enabled piracy and ignored imperial law into communities that adhered to the law, internalized it, and shunned pirates. So the British Empire didn't just suppress piracy by force, it delegitimized it in the hearts and minds of constituents. So piracy scholars describe a dramatic growth in Britain's naval command at sea and a dramatic growth in Britain's administrative command at port in the civilian population. I myself was not a piracy specialist when I got into this business. I'm a scholar of colonial America and of the British Empire. And I just did not see good evidence for this kind of strong central governance and control in the First British Empire. In contrast to the narrative I just described to you, I found that piracy was not suppressed in the 1720s. It persisted for a full century into the 1830s and 40s, despite a state-sponsored campaign to suppress and delegitimize it. And the public remained complicit in piracy, in the pirate trade in the 18th century, just as it had been during the golden age of piracy. You see, the golden age didn't end with this massive crackdown. It continued, and the public, just as it was before, continued to see it as a legitimate form of trade. So despite increasingly harsh anti-piracy legislation in Parliament, the Atlantic remained a violent frontier in which armed commerce remained normal and acceptable. Okay. And when piracy disappeared later in the 1840s, a century later, more than a century, it was not due to forceful confrontation at sea and port, but a result of economic factors that made piracy less profitable in the Atlantic following the outbreak of a stable peace in 1815, after a century of war. So I won't lay out the case for all of this. There are publications to do that. I just wanted to illustrate that the debate about piracy, past and present, is a debate about the power, authority, and legitimacy of states. Okay? It's about the ability of a government to use law, policing, prosecution, and persuasion to reach into peripheral communities and stamp out a practice that constituents there see or saw as conventional, beneficial, reasonable, and legal. Okay? So since the story of Atlantic piracy reveals the limits, as I see it, according to the minority report that I represent, since the story of Atlantic piracy reveals the limits of Britain's naval command at sea, bureaucratic reach at port, and moral legitimacy, I mean, the limits of its command at sea, the limits of its bureaucratic reach at port, and the limits of Britain's moral legitimacy in the hearts and minds of its subjects, what I want to do is to identify the factors that encouraged piracy and hampered suppression in the 18th century. So first are the kind of the obvious or objective traits of this trade, and that the cargoes are lucrative and the seas are vast. Okay? So we all understand that piracy is an economic crime. What triggers it is lucrative cargoes going back and forth at sea, and an environment that offers robbers privacy and safety. Okay, kind of like a dark alley or a deserted road. The Atlantic provided both lucrative cargoes and privacy and safety for robbers. We're conditioned to believe that a navy can police an ocean because the vastness of the ocean is beyond the spatial imagination of most of us. Okay? Most of us cannot grasp how endless and empty those expanses of water are. Plus, we have archives full of laws and proclamations and trial records and privateering commissions that on paper paint a picture of a governed sea. But even though the state's monopoly on violence at sea was articulated in law, at least in statutory law, it was not accepted as legitimate in coastal communities and in their local courts. And it was certainly not accepted as a practical reality at sea. We know from our own experience with drug abuse or illegal immigration, for example, that things that are outlawed by statute are not always treated as criminal by citizens and even by local courts. I mentioned that the piracy disappeared in the Atlantic in the 1840s, not through forceful suppression at sea, but peacefully and inadvertently due to reduced profits from contraband. This was due to, number one, shifts in the maritime economy in the 18th century, and two, it was due to the peacetime economies after 1815, after the end of the Napoleonic Wars. And third, the free trade policies that were initiated and expanded towards the mid-19th century. So from the 16th century to the 19th century, okay, to the end and after the end of the Napoleonic Wars, for this very long period, Atlantic commerce took place in a war zone because imperial conflicts simply persisted there. Regardless of what was happening in Europe, a state of war always existed at sea and in American waters. And because imperial conflicts produced spikes in demand and disruptions in supplies, in supply, and unpredictability and embargoes and high taxes. They also produced high profits for pirates and smugglers. Okay, so wartime conditions, wartime economies, their needs, their disruptions, their instabilities, create an opening, create an opportunity for great profits for pirates and smugglers. But the outbreak of a lasting peace in 1815, after what's called the long 18th century of near constant imperial warfare, created different economic conditions, stabilizing local economies and reducing profits from illegal trade. Okay? And then illegal trade became even less profitable when Britain reduced consumption taxes and removed various trade restrictions. So what allowed piracy to persist despite anti-piracy legislation and prosecutions was the persistence of economic conditions that created profitable market for contraband on which whole communities depended. And in this context, the government's campaign against pirates and smugglers was injurious to local communities and local governments. Okay, so pirates and smugglers were the benefactors of these local communities. They were not their enemies. And this explains why local mobs liberated pirates and smugglers and their cargoes from custody when in the rare occasions that they were arrested. And when these people were indicted, juries regularly, routinely acquitted them. Local mayors, magistrates, judges, prosecutors, and governors lent a helping hand as well. The point is that these officials were not corrupted into tolerating piracy. They simply shared the interests, ethics, and legal beliefs of their constituents and their neighbors on this issue. Freebooters and smugglers were not a fringe criminal subculture. Okay? They were not a fringe and they were not criminals. They conducted their trade in the open in colonial towns and ports, and they enjoyed material, civic, and political rewards for the service they provided to their local economies, communities, and local governments. This is why the governmental campaign against pirates, wreckers, smugglers, and contraband traders was primarily the central government's, the British government, the imperial government's campaign against wrecking, smuggling, contraband trading, etc., was primarily a public relations campaign against the commercial, legal, and moral beliefs of consumers, merchants, and local officials, officials of local governments. Okay? And you can see this in the fact that, excuse me, trial records of piracy cases were published and disseminated, and they're sitting in our archives today for us to get a certain impression of the atmosphere and the campaign against piracy. So they were published and disseminated because governments tried to disseminate and justify and legitimize the metropolitan government, the central government's view of piracy, which conflicted with the view of the general public. Okay? So these published records, these published court proceedings reveal the Crown's recognition that the public was resistant to its novel understanding of the law, of maritime jurisdiction and commercial restrictions, etc. Now, beyond the PR campaign, there was also an actual law enforcement campaign. And what hampered it were the limited capabilities of navies and courts. The first, naval captains were not always eager to chase and attack pirates, since pirate-infested waters opened up commercial opportunities for naval officers. Second, warships, so I mean, basically they could make a living off of escorting commercial vessels through pirate-infested waters. Second, warships were ill-equipped or ill-suited to hunting pirates. Okay, they're just big and lumbering. Pirate ships were fast and nimble. There's a quotation from Admiral Vernon, who said that sending a warship to catch a pirate vessel is like sending a cow to capture a hare. So those two factors. Third, policing at sea, even if they wanted to, okay, policing at sea was beyond the capabilities of sailing navies. Okay? We know that naval blockades could not prevent blockade running for long. And that's a relatively modest assignment, okay, to blockade a small piece of coastline or port. And we know that even in wartime, when the Royal Navy helped the Customs Service control the English coast, a massive smuggling trade flourished in the slender waters of the English Channel. Okay? So patrolling and controlling the Atlantic was several bridges too far. Okay? It was both costly and impracticable. Now, using warships as escorts for merchant convoys was feasible for navies and effective and desirable for insurance underwriters. However, it didn't appeal to merchants because it created delays. I mean, you had to wait for the convoy to form and for the escorts to come, and then you would head out to sea. So it created delays. It increased spoilage and other costs, labor costs, etc. And it also depressed prices at the destination because a convoy would arrive with a glut of goods. And these losses, unlike piracy losses, convoying losses could not be recovered through insurance. You couldn't claim an insurance, you couldn't make an insurance claim because you lost money in selling goods that arrived in convoy, or because you had to pay your sailors overtime, just to sit in court to wait for a convoy. But if you were attacked by pirates, that was recoverable through insurance. Okay, so merchants weren't as interested in taking advantage of naval vessels acting as escorts for convoys. So since the Royal Navy and Merchant Navy did not tackle pirates at sea, it was left to customs agents and prosecutors to pursue them on land. But here too, despite the PR campaign against pirates, wreckers, and smugglers, and despite the increasingly harsh penalties on those who were convicted, the scope of these illegal trades actually increased during the government's quote-unquote crackdown. And so the reason is that because royal budgets were stretched by constant and never-ending war and by post-war debts, there simply were not enough customs agents to man all ports around the empire. And in those ports where they did have a presence, customs officers were too few. You know, they did not have the muscle to confront crews engaged in illegal trade, or to protect themselves, you know, the customs agents, to protect themselves from the violence of those who at port who worked with illegal traders and trafficked with them or otherwise supported them. And customs agents certainly could not compete with the locals' political and moral influence over local officials and local juries. So they were ill-equipped. They weren't everywhere. Where they were too few and weak, just in terms of manpower to confront local mobs. And they didn't have the political and economic influence that local people had over their local officials and prosecutors and juries. Prosecutors, too, found that grand juries, and even judges did not share the Crown's hostility towards pirates and smugglers, nor did they share the Crown's legal beliefs regarding maritime trade. Specifically, the British state claimed to have jurisdiction to punish crimes on the high seas. This clashed with the established and widespread understanding that state authority did not extend beyond coastal waters. Both sailors at sea and jurists in court understood the, I mean jurists, not jurors, but jurists, you know, legal minds. Okay, so both uneducated sailors who were familiar with the sea, and the best legal minds in Europe and the colonies, who worked with the law, understood that the sea was a lawless zone. It was beyond the jurisdiction and the practical reach of any king, legislature, and courts of law. And as late as the 19th century, the US Supreme Court doubted whether acts that were outlawed by statute were indeed criminal when committed at sea, beyond the, again, so they had this conception that a court's or legislature's or a king's jurisdiction carried only as far as the coast and, you know, coastal waters, which usually was 3 or 7 miles from the coast, the range of a cannon shot. So again, the U.S. Supreme Court in the 19th century, which was not shy about claiming far-reaching jurisdictions, expressed doubt whether acts that are illegal by U.S. law were indeed illegal, criminal, if they were committed at sea, outside the United States, or outside of any jurisdiction. Efforts to extend jurisdiction from the land to the sea through prize courts, admiralty courts, privateering commissions, royal pardons, and diplomatic agreements of various sorts, and issuing passports to trace a ship's port of origin or nationality, all proved ineffective at regulating or pacifying maritime or oceanic trade. Illegal trade was so resilient because it was not seen as criminal or disreputable or unpatriotic. It was defended not simply on economic grounds, that goods are coming to, cheap goods are coming to shore, or that we can sell our goods to these illegal traders. Rather, it was defended in moral, legal, and constitutional terms. So violent seizure at sea was accepted as a historic, as an ancient and legitimate feature of maritime trade. And when new standards of criminality were introduced through statutory law, through parliamentary legislation, the law was seen as novel and illegitimate and unconstitutional. Now, all these previous factors were status quo factors. Okay, so things remaining the same despite the imperial government's efforts to effect change. Okay, the government tried to change things, but had limited ability, limited range, limited legitimacy, limited manpower, limited resources. The one change factor was marine insurance. And this change factor also worked against suppression. So as the insurance market expanded, increased competition between underwriters, reduced premiums, so like any innovative product, okay? Flat screen TVs, very expensive at the beginning, and then price goes down. Smartphones, etc. The same goes for marine insurance. Okay, so as the market expanded and competition increased, premiums were reduced and coverage increased. Okay, so you could, it increased up to 99% of a ship's value. Okay, so you could insure more at a lower and lower price or premium. The result was that merchants insured, that is actually very hard to say. Merchants insured ships as a matter of course for long distance voyages. Okay, and this was a novelty. Okay. They were therefore financially insulated, again, in long range voyages, which were now routinely insured for up to 99% of the cost of the value of the ship for a relatively modest premium. This therefore rendered these merchants financially insulated from commerce raiding, from piracy, privateering, which, since they were insured, it removed their incentive to avoid dangerous water, to avoid dangerous waters, remove their incentive to sail in convoy, or to invest in other defensive measures. Okay, for example, they could add guns and crew members at the expense of cargo. Remove some of the cargo and add guns and crew. Okay, but of course, it means that you're paying more, reducing profits, because you're bringing less cargo to shore, and your competitors are not doing it. And why do it when, if you suffer an attack, you can recover the losses from insurers? Okay, so before cargoes were insured, ships traveled armed. But once insurance became prevalent and commonplace, cannons and crews were replaced with additional cargo. So merchants didn't face financial pressure to protect their cargoes, and they didn't face much social pressure to protect sailors by arming their ships. The result being that cheap insurance actually increased the prevalence of violent seizure at sea. And the growing popularity of ransoming, which is again an innovation in commerce raiding, further encouraged commerce raiding. Okay, so you have an innovation in insurance, which encourages commerce raiding, and then you have an innovation in commerce raiding, privateering, piracy, that also encouraged it. So, I mean, We can discuss this later, the details of this novelty, of this novel practice of ransoming. But basically, having the captor simply extort a fee was a huge improvement over seizure of the ship for everyone concerned. It was an improvement for the pirates or privateers because it meant that they could capture a number of prizes in a single voyage rather than having to capture a ship, bring it back to port, capture another ship, bring it back to port. Okay, so they could be more successful in a single voyage, extracting, again, money instead of dealing with the trouble of collecting, of now having a captured ship and its cargo and its sailors on your hands and having to deal with selling them. It was a benefit, ransoming was a benefit for merchant crews because, obviously they weren't captured and killed. They could continue with their voyage and get paid for their labor. It was a benefit for merchants because they just paid basically a tax to the pirates, and they could continue with their voyage and sell their goods. And the ransom that they paid was recoverable by insurance. And of course, it was beneficial to investors for the same reason, because the ship was not lost and the cargo was not lost. And it was beneficial even for insurers, because they didn't lose the entire cargo. They weren't on the hook for the value of the entire cargo and the ship. They're only on the hook for the ransom. Okay, so everyone's a winner, except the consumer, who has to pay a higher price for a marginally higher price for all this, because to provide a living income for the pirates. So this list I gave you identifies the factors that sustain piracy and undermine suppression in the 18th century. The question is, how useful is this history from the age of sail to a discussion on piracy in the age of diesel and satellite-based GPS? My own sense is that the 18th century is still relevant today, and that lawlessness at sea was a feature of the sea rather than a feature of pre-modern states or pre-modern technology. But once we leave the 18th century, I'm beyond my province, so I will leave it to my co-panelists, since they're experts on the 21st century. Thank you.